What is happening, superfans? You're listening to Behind the Mask, the show where we chat with your favorite superhero fiction authors about the worlds and heroes they are writing. Behind the Mask is brought to you in conjunction with the amazing folks over at superherofiction.com. I'm your host, Franklin Kendrick, and today on the show, I am pleased to be chatting with author Nancy O'Toole Meservier. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you so much for letting me on.
You are welcome. We are happy to have you on. So, the first question could be a difficult question, could be easy, depending on how secretive your secret identity is. But when you're not a superhero fiction author behind the keyboard, what is your secret identity out in the real world?
Well, it's not very secretive. I'm a librarian, which is actually something I've been for quite a while. When I was in high school, I would shelve books. I've worked at the circulation desk. I've run volunteer programs based around sending people out into the community to read to kids. I ran a small library for a number of years in like
Oh
a rural
gosh.
community here in Maine. And now I'm a cataloger. I'm mainly behind the scenes, and I work at a local library here in the Lewiston, Auburn area. So, yeah.
Oh, cool. So did you have to like do all the courses and stuff, or did you get in like somehow without having to do all the school?
Oh no, I have the degree. I when I graduated from college, I did have a brief time where I worked in a call center, and that was hell for me.
Oh
Like that
boy.
was, I don't recommend it. It was probably good because it made me more confident talking on the phone because you had to be. But it made me so miserable. So miserable enough that I was willing to put myself in a whole lot of debt by going back to library school. And then I graduated into recession and had a lot of fun part-time jobs before I got a full-time job. But yeah, you don't need to get a degree to be a librarian nowadays, but it certainly helps.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Oh boy. And plus, like, I'm sure you learn a lot as you go along. Just in
Yes.
general, it's not as simple as people probably believe it is.
Yeah, people seem to be under the impression that I just sit around and, read all day, which, would be nice. But no, I mean, cataloging, for example, is a lot of like computer and data entry stuff. And you have to be really knowledgeable about books and stuff and what's coming up. So there are always more things than people assume.
Oh yeah. So writing.
Mhm.
This is sort of like a jumping off point, I guess. This is not how I typically word it, but would you say that writing a book is easier than cataloging data entry?
I would say that both are more complicated than you think they're going to be. I definitely feel like you think cataloging is going to be very simple, but there are always extra layers that you're unaware of. And writing a book is definitely a lot more complicated than you think it's going to be. Um, I'm putting together one right now for NaNoWriMo, and just the process of plotting things out and trying to find balance between like the character arcs and the subplots is a headache. So yeah, more complicated than you think.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
What initially got you into writing fiction, and then what kind of steered you into doing something in the superhero fiction genre?
Oh, I've always written. Like I started writing back when I was in kindergarten and I was learning how to read and write. I even got these paper certificates from my teacher, Superstar Awards, I think they were called. I think my mother still has a few of them, for writing Rebus stories, which were like half pictures, half words.
Mhm.
Like to me, it's never been enough just to consume words and consume fiction. I also have to write it myself and create my own.
Mhm.
As for writing about superheroes, that took a little longer. I started writing about superheroes back in 2014. And it's kind of ironic we're having this discussion now because I started writing superheroes during National Novel Writing Month,
Oh
and which
yes.
is in the next month. And for people that aren't aware, for National Novel Writing Month, you're supposed to write a novel in a month, or at least 50,000 words of one.
Mhm.
And back in 2014, I was getting a little smug because I had done 5 nanos and I had won every single time and I was going to win this one. So I definitely bit off more that I could chew. I picked out this giant epic fantasy novel idea with like 6 different perspectives and these political subplots and tragic romances and warring countries. And it was a bad idea, and I kept on coming up against a wall where I would start the book and I wouldn't get very far. Um, but the challenge is still going on. So you're getting further and further into the month and closer to the end of the month. And I'm realizing that I'm never going to get 50,000 words out of this idea. So I'm like, well, I'll cheat a little and I will make 50,000 words from 2 separate ideas. So I pulled a new idea that was based partially on a concept I came up with when I was like in college, and based a lot on the media that I was reading at the time, and watching at the time. And I have to be honest, like it was like 95% superheroes then, I feel like, and that's not really an exaggeration. Like I was watching the Marvel movies and I was watching Arrow and I was reading a ton of X-Men comics. So it makes sense that I would end up writing about superheroes. And I did succeed. I wrote 20,000 words. I won that year, and the 20,000 words would eventually turn into the beginning of Red and Black.
Nice.
Yeah.
I would say you're not the only one who has totally had to abandon a project that was going to be great for Nano halfway through.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like a couple years ago that happened to me, and I was like, really? Even after I outlined, even after everything, once you get into the actual weeds of the drafting, sometimes it's like it looks great as an outline, and you're like, I just don't feel this anymore.
And you really can't get too comfortable when it comes to writing. Like you feel like, oh, I've done this before. I'm familiar. I've done all the right things. But every book is its own challenge, and sometimes you are just not up for that challenge.
Absolutely. And especially, I feel like a lot of us have tried at one point to write like an epic fantasy because we've read them and like we love them.
Like, who doesn't want to
But
be Brandon Sanderson?
oh boy. And I've listened to so many of his like online courses and everything. He makes it sound super easy, but it
Mhm.
is not easy.
No, it is not.
You got to keep track of so many things. It's kind of
Especially when a long book too.
oh yeah,
Yeah,
because they're required to be like if you write a short one, it's like oh this
no.
isn't really epic. It's like
Yeah, we need
what
600 pages. Thank you very much.
600 pages? Yeah. Oh boy, I'm beginning to really appreciate the shorter, like brisker sort of stories because it's just like unless I'm listening to something as I do other things, my
Mhm.
time of sitting down and reading a giant epic, it's like there's only so many that you can give the time to.
Oh, I feel that, especially 2020 and in the time of COVID. I do not want to read a giant doorstopper novel. I want to read something that is quick and satisfying. So
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah, it's not so much about the journey right now. It's more like I want to feel like something has completed.
It's happened.
Oh my goodness. So speaking of, worlds and heroes and characters and all of that, give us sort of give us like an intro overview of your superhero books. What are I'm assuming it is a series, but what are they
Yes.
all about?
Okay, so I've written the Red and Black series. We have 3 books so far. So Red and Black is the first one, Black and Blue, and then Silver and Gold. I am very unoriginal with my titles. But the Red and Black series is all about this sort of shy, awkward, college age girl named Dawn. And she wants nothing more than to be a superhero. She loves comic books. She loves reading about superheroes, fictional ones, real life ones. And so she really wants to be Bailey City, where she lives. She wants to be their first superhero. And then she gets powers. So she dives right into it. And Red and Black is about her first real challenge where she faces other people with powers. So you have Calypso, who is a woman who has the power to make anyone loyal to her with a touch of her hand. And you have her lead henchman, Faultline, who is just this powerhouse of a fighter. And what Dawn doesn't know is the fact that when Faultline is, sort of behind the mask, when he's not being a bad guy, he's just Alex Gage, regular everyday working class guy trying to scrounge together enough money to support his sisters. And Dawn thinks that Alex is really charming and really handsome. And Alex thinks that Dawn is super cute and super nice. And so they have this sort of dynamic where like they have these really cute encounters on the street and they maybe go out for dinner. But then, at night, they are just tearing each other apart because they're working against each other on opposite sides of this conflict. So that's what the series is about. Yeah.
So what for your superheroes, how do they get their powers? Is it like a plot point, or is it something that you came up with that you can speak about?
It's kind of a plot point, but I guess it's safe to say that it's mainly genetic. You get your superpowers because you happen to have family member, like a family line that happens to have superpowers, and if you are fortunate enough, you get them through certain means that are explored in book 2. So yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to jump around in my questions a little
Yeah,
bit.
sure.
Normally this question comes later on, but for inspirations, were you inspired by like West Side Story type like rivalries? What are some of the things that inspired you to write this sort of story?
Well, for the romantic aspect, I've always been fond of like those superhero, supervillain type romances like Batman and Catwoman and Daredevil and Elektra and stuff like that. I think they're really interesting and how they sort of almost bring to an extreme version to the forefront of something I notice about like real life and how we bring different aspects of ourselves to different parts of our lives. So the person that you are on a date isn't necessarily the person you are when you're at work. And when you're dealing with superheroes, like you're dealing with people that literally have different identities. So it brings it to such an extreme level that I think is really interesting to explore. And it's also sort of like a fun version of like enemies to lovers, I guess as the trope is called, because they don't even know they're enemies. And that's a lot of fun. But as for inspiration, the main inspiration behind the Red and Black series was City of Heroes, which was I don't know if you ever played it, the superhero MMO, the video game.
I never played it, but I did know people that did play it.
Yeah, like I've never really been into MMOs. I'm more of a like give me a Mario game and that makes me happy. But I got super into this one. And the more I play a certain character, like the more I get into their head and I create a story for them. And that's what happened with Dawn. I created this complex story for her. And it was awful. It was absolutely atrocious when I first made it when I was back in college, probably because I was in college and not very good at this stuff yet. Like, oh man, like Dawn had like this soap opera illness, like one of those vaguely defined illnesses, and she was healed by this angelic figure, and like there was a totally unnecessary love triangle between Dawn, Alex, and Calypso that made Alex look like a two-timer. And like there was nothing good about this, absolutely. And I have no idea how I managed to make a good story out of it. I wanted to turn it into a web comic because I was convinced that you couldn't write a superhero story. It had to be in a comic form or visual in some way. And it's a good thing I can't draw because it would have been really bad. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And web comics is like a whole other like can of worms.
Oh yeah.
And like it's already demanding enough to try to keep a novel series going, but then to constantly be like every week, where's your new comic page? Like, oh no.
Yeah, for like 15 years or something ridiculous like that.
Oh
or
yeah. I
Yeah.
admire those people and I love to read the stuff, but that's not for me. I could never be that sort of creator.
No, same here.
So I guess you've already sort of answered. I mean, well, maybe not. For supervillains, do you have any that are like strictly a villain that they are set out to take down? Or is it because it's the romance genre? It's not so much like I'm gonna kill my adversary. It's more like I'm gonna fall in love with my adversary and we're gonna find common ground.
Well, you can't do the same thing with every one of your villains. So I have villains definitely in my series that are more complex and more redeemable, and then I have villains that are sort of like they power run amok, I guess you can
Mhm.
say. And then I have villains that are real jerks. But with Alex, like the one of the main reasons that I came up with his character is I wanted to be able to explore two sides of a conflict. Like especially when you're dealing with, say, like a first person perspective, which my books are written in, and you spend so much time separate from the bad guys, you really don't get to see what's going on there. So with Alex, it was sort of my idea of sort of delving into more what was going on the villain side of things, and that's kind of where things came in with him.
Cool. Yeah, that is something that I feel like that I mean I've read some romance and they
Hmm.
do a great job of kind of like showing you both perspectives,
Yeah.
especially when they're first person. Usually it's like alternating back and forth. So when you think that whoever the lead, I guess in this case, if it's a
Hmm.
romance story, they're both sort of leads.
Yeah, they're
But
kind of dual perspectives.
you kind of see like the conflict from both sides, obviously, but it's like, oh, the things that one character finds as a roadblock, when you read the other perspective, you just want to like reach through the page and be like, no, why are you upset about this? If
Hmm.
only you knew what they were too afraid to say to you. So I love that sort of tension.
Yeah, we have a scene in the first book that is they're literally their first date, they're going out to eat at a restaurant. And during this, they both catch sight of this guy, and Alex is like, "Oh, I'm supposed to kidnap that guy." And Dawn's like, "That's the guy I just saved from being kidnapped. I got to talk to him about this." And they both have to find excuses to leave the table and deal with it. So I liked having how sort of, no matter how hard they try, their superhero lives and their regular lives they're going to clash. It's impossible for them not to.
Oh my gosh, that sounds
Yeah.
amazing. So what about the world that your heroes and villains live in? Is it sort of based on our actual Earth, or is it like a fictionalized version?
So Bailey City is definitely a fictional city. Um, I thought about like having it take place somewhere I was somewhat familiar with, like Boston or something like that. Then I'm like, no, I'm not that familiar with Boston, and I would probably, annoy people that live there. So I created a fictional city that I kind of see as being like a miniature Boston. But even though it's made up, I kind of wanted to have like some foot in reality. I don't like write gritty realism, but it always bothers me when you come across like a book series or a TV show um, that explores fantastical elements in the real world, but
Mhm.
they somehow exist in a world where these fantastical elements have never been explored before. Like they've never heard of superheroes, or like it's a vampire show or something like that, and the only vampire media that exists is Dracula and not the years and years worth of stuff that we've been exploring. And that always just takes me out of the story, because I feel like that's more unrealistic than anything else. So in this world, like I wanted superheroes to come about in a world where people had been reading about superheroes, whether it be through comic books or movies and stuff like that, for as long as we have. So in my world, like real superheroes have been out for a few years, and the people that become superheroes, they tend to be superhero fans to begin with, like Dawn. Like she loves reading about superheroes and comic books. And yeah, to me that works a little better than trying to pretend that people never knew superheroes existed. Yeah. Oh, and also the way that I explore superheroes in the book, like people read regular comics like we do with like, Iron Man or Wonder Woman, but they also read comics about superheroes that exist in their worlds, which I
Okay.
feel like would probably happen.
Yeah, you gotta as soon as you get a name for yourself, you gotta like merchandise that,
Oh yeah.
sell the t-shirts, get your brand out there.
Hmm.
And it's not always nefarious, and it's not always. I have a bunch of friends that have been watching The Boys on Amazon, and I'm like,
Oh, is that any good? I haven't seen that. I don't have
it's
Prime, so.
it's very gritty, it's
Hmm.
very brutal, but I mean, if you're like you go in and you know from the beginning what it's going to be like. It's
Hmm.
very sort of like cynical for the most part, but then there's characters that are like hopeful that you're
Hmm.
follow, but it's like they take a lot of things where it's like, oh, of course I'm gonna manipulate my image for the public, but
Hmm.
behind the scenes I'm a terrible person. It's like, yeah, I expect that, but not all the time. Like, not everybody who I feel like would get superpowers would just be a giant jerk and then
No.
be passing themselves off as like a likable person. So,
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Like with Dawn, for example, like she wants to be a superhero because she loves superheroes,
mhm.
which makes sense to me. And she actually uses the knowledge that she has gained by reading comic books to sort of guide her along the way. Like she creates rules in her heads, being like, okay, I learned about this about secret identities, and I learned this about sort of work-life balance, and she tries to use those rules to guide her. But obviously, things get more complicated than she expects pretty quickly.
Oh yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
For even just thinking about like actual real life, like the heroes that we look up to, sometimes they make it look really simple and easy what they do, but
Mhm.
then when you're inspired by them to try to do it, and then you find out all of the like cogs that go into the
Mhm.
machinery and you're like, oh wow, I had no idea this was this difficult. Good job on you, whoever the hero is, for making it look so simple.
And there's also just the aspect that like experiencing it for yourself is a lot different than reading about it. Like you read about like the X-Men and all like the interpersonal issues they have in like high drama and stuff like that. And that seems, entertaining from a perspective of a reader, but then, it's another thing entirely to experience it yourself.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I don't remember if it's somebody in the media that said this one time or if it was just a comment I read somewhere, but they were talking about comics and I think it was like specifically superhero comics where they said like wouldn't it be so nice if life wrapped itself up in like the 27 pages of a comic story,
Mhm.
like clean, you're at the end, that's it, and then the next month there'll be more. It's like that's not really in in real life how it works, but like in like superhero fiction, specifically like superhero novels, I feel like a lot of authors that I've talked to have kind of like taken that and we have a lot more words we can use because we are using like the traditional novel structure to tell an emotional story. So we're not just relying on thought bubbles and all of that stuff, but you can like explore like the more emotional internal aspect of these characters.
Yeah. I also think the fact that book series are expected to end,
Mhm.
well, for the most part, also works in our favor because I mean, you have these comic books that have been going on for decades. And let's be honest, like some of the things that these people have gone through, they should be giant balls of PTSD. They should be non-functioning. Like they go through like annual giant, horrifying events in some cases. But the fact that we don't have to worry about that, like we can bring our characters to an end at some point, I think actually works for our favors. We don't have to magically erase anything because we know eventually that, we're going to end. We don't have to refresh things constantly.
Definitely. Well, speaking of plot and
Mm-hmm.
overarching things and all that and mashing characters together, uh, do you have a favorite plot line that you have written that you would be able to talk about? Or do you have sort of like, are there any twists that came to you in the writing process that you thought, oh my gosh, this is like my spark of brilliance that I've been waiting for?
I do have a favorite plot, but I feel kind of that's in book four, so I can't talk about it too much.
Okay.
Um, I've always been a sucker for basically plot lines that involve things like time travel, alternate universe, darkest timeline sort of things. So any sort of plot line that goes, okay, but what if things get to be the worst? What would happen? How would our characters react to that? And that is something I get to do in book four when I do have a time travel plot line. And I had like a blast writing it. And because I'd never written something like that before. In just the interesting places I was able to take these characters that I had never done before. So it's not out yet. That's coming out early next year. It's in beta reads right now. And so far, people were reacting very, positively to that. So, but as far as what already exists in the text, I would definitely have to go back to like the superhero, supervillain romance. Like I am just a sucker for those storylines, and I really like getting to write about it. I also like getting to write about like fight scenes on modes of transportation, which I know is a little different. Like I have a chase two fight scenes involving cars, one in a van, other on top of the cars. I have one on a train because train fight scenes are the best like ever. I think we can all agree. I have one coming up in a helicopter. So it's just sort of like a wonderful wish fulfillment thing to finally get to write like my favorite types of scenes.
Oh my gosh, yes. So I'm coming up with a couple other questions.
Oh, sure.
So, speaking of like epic fights and battles on transportation and all that, are there any like superhero tropes that you were like, yes, I am going to do it? Because I feel like the epic action scenes, I don't know if it's considered a trope. I definitely don't. I I notice it a lot more in like movies and TV as opposed to like books. But to me, those are always the scenes that I'm like, yes, I will rewatch these over and over and over. And like, if it was in a book, I would be like, I'm putting a sticky note right here so I can go back and read that epic scene again. Is there anything besides like the giant fights that you were like, yes, I want to be sure that I include this just because I enjoy this part of the genre so much?
Can I answer that one without spoiling anything?
I know
Oh,
everything is like meticulously for a
uh,
lot of writers, everything is like meticulously plotted just because of the nature of like novel series. Like
mhm.
unless they're each standalone. So like you can be vague because I would be if it was my series because my series also builds upon itself. So I'm like, ugh.
I okay. Let's. I enjoy getting to write. I get to a giant evil corporation type storylines. I'm kind of a sucker for those when I read them. Like the company that's all out for profiting and making the money and ends up doing horrible things in the process. I do have one of those in my books. And there's an evil scientist type character that I had a lot of fun writing. So yeah.
I gotta say, even just today, I had it wasn't really so much a conversation with a coworker, but it was more like a me talking to a coworker and not shutting up about in the Smallville has come up like I don't know a bunch of times this week. I
Mhm.
don't know if it's because they just did their virtual Comic Con panel and it's just been on my brain, but I had to be like, oh my gosh, and Lionel Luthor runs the giant like Luthor
Mhm.
Corp, and it's so nefarious, and you don't know if you can trust him, but there are times where you have to trust him, but your brain is like, no, and they're like, the coworker is just like, oh my gosh, like what? How? I didn't know anything about this, and I'm like, yep, this is like one of the things that I
Mhm.
loved so much about that series was just like I'm also a sucker for the crazy, like, oh yeah, we're a corporation and don't get on our bad side because we're funding your entire town or city or whatever it is.
Yes, which definitely gets explored. I think it's easy to relate to the evil corporation storyline because every now and then something comes out in the headline about a big company having some less than great practices with employees or something like that. So it's not really all that much of a logical leap to go, oh, and what if they did these horrible things? So it's
Mhm,
easy to connect to. Yeah.
definitely. My other question that I thought of while you were answering one of my other questions was, and I know it's in your next book that's coming out, but your time travel
Mhm.
is is your time travel the type of time travel where you go back and if you change something, it ruins all of the future if you do something wrong? Or is it more forgiving?
Okay, so I have a character in my book called Forecaster, who has the ability to see the future, and he has a saying something like, "The past is set in stone, the present is malleable, and the possibilities for the future are infinite."
Mhm.
So I'm definitely more in the sort of like Avengers Endgame sort of style of time travel, where um, like there's only so much you can change. So like a
Mhm.
character can travel to the future and see the future, for example, but they can't change the past. But that comes with its own set of complications. Like if you go to the future and now you want to change the horrible things that have happened in the future, but what if the things you do along the way make things worse or accelerate the bad things? So I try to keep my time travel mostly logical. I think there's always sort of allowances people make, but I try not to overcomplicate things because you don't want to end up in like an X-Men situation where no one really knows what happened anymore. So
Definitely. I was not really a huge fan of the whole like Days of Future Past. I know a lot of
oh
people loved it, but
yeah.
I don't know. I was only really happy when it goes back to like the original beginning of the timeline where I'm like, oh, the characters as I remember them.
There was
Yes.
no last stand. Thank you.
Yeah, really. That's the only time that I was happy. Whenever they were younger, I was like, can we like fast forward? I don't care about any of your histories.
I really like that movie, actually. Sorry
no,
about that.
no judgment for that. But like personally, I just wished they had been like, and I'm sure it was probably the actors being like, yeah, we're done. We're only willing to do cameos at this point in our careers. But I was just like, can we please just erase all of like, yeah, we love Michael Fassbender, but can we
We
just
really
get
want
them
to see Ian McKellen.
like seriously, get Ian McKellen back, get all of them back, do one more movie. It'll be X-Men 4 that we should have had. And then, but they were all at like various parts of the globe and doing all these different things. I understand why.
Yeah.
It would be easier to do that if it was just a comic book, which of course
Yep.
they've done.
Yes.
So, but man, that time travel stuff, I was like, oh no. Just can we just get back to the beginning? All right. Sorry, I keep taking us on tangents now.
That's okay.
Let's see what I got. I jumped around a little bit, so I don't want to repeat my questions that I already asked. So, all right, you kind of already answered this question, but I'll ask it anyway. So, your fourth book, is there anything for readers that have read your first three that you can sort of like tease besides that there's time travel, that if they go back and reread your first three, they can sort of like piece together clues of what to expect?
Well, they're definitely building towards something. I feel like I definitely have a book that you need to read. You need to read the books in order. Like I did have some people that picked up book 2 and were perfectly fine. So that's one thing. But the further you get into the series, the more that you sort of build upon things that have been established in previous books. I don't know if that answered your question, but you do get to see some plot lines that are started in earlier books sort of go to extreme levels as a result of the time travel element. So yeah.
Cool. So this one is not on my list of questions, but is book 4, is that the end of the story for these characters, or do you plan to have more books beyond?
I'm planning on doing 7. So book 4 is kind of like the turning point, I guess you could say. So yeah, I've actually do have work already done on book 5, which is a lot of fun. And next month for Nano, I'm going to be working on book 6. So I really need to finish things off then. So 7 books is the goal.
Yeah. Coolness. So what outside of Nano, what is your writing schedule like? How do you like fully plot out your books ahead of time and then follow the blueprint, or are you a pantser?
When I first started writing, and even the earlier books, the first 2 books in the series, I was very much a pantser. Like the first 2 books were, pretty much completely pantsed. And as a result, the revision process was hell. Like especially for the second book, I had to throw out basically the entire second half of the book because I just realized that it wasn't working. There were too many elements that I was juggling, and it was just too confusing. And then I thought I had finally gotten everything right, and then I went through my next round revisions. I realized that I still didn't have everything right, and I had to throw out like the final quarter of the book. So like I remember being in a restaurant with a friend and like in tears, like because I couldn't figure out how to put this book together, and I'm like, it shouldn't be that difficult. So since then, I have gotten more serious about planning ahead. And I've noticed that with every project that I've worked on, whether it be the Red and Wax series or something else, that I do end up planning more. I don't necessarily need to know everything when I start to write a book, but I need to have a really strong idea, like about, like a really detailed idea of like the beginning, and a really strong idea about the middle, and a good enough idea about the end. Um, I feel like, especially when it comes to things like, character development and stuff like that, and character arcs, those are harder for me to plan because they tend to happen a little more organically. So oftentimes when I get into the weeds of things, I realize that the things that I plan don't work. So I feel like even if you're a plotter, like I guess like you'd say I more am now, you need to have some flexibility, because you need, no matter what, you need to make sure you're doing what's right for the book, not necessarily what was right for your carefully laid plan. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've noticed that I do plan a lot more. I feel like I was in the same boat where when I first started this out, I thought about my first book so much in my head
Yeah.
that it just came naturally, and like the story structure just kind of falls into place. But once you get past your first book, or maybe even your first like two books, it becomes like increasingly difficult to keep track of everything just in your memory, because if you're building sequentially, then
Yeah.
like I've had to go back and flip through books, and I know that there are like famous writers that are like, yeah, I never reread my own stuff, but it's like you kind of need to keep track of everything if you're doing a long running series.
Yeah,
So I
it's one thing if you're just sort of doing one-offs, and then it doesn't
yeah.
really matter. Like, but if you're trying to, build towards something bigger, um, yeah, that I definitely have to. I have my on my desk where I am. I have all of my proofs, and I keep them specifically for those reasons, so I can go back and look things up, even if it's just, oh God, what color are Riley's eyes, or something like
Oh
that,
my
or
gosh,
something
the
more
amount of
detailed.
times, the amount of times. It's like, what color like was the streak in this person's hair? That's the thing that I come up with, because like my brain will play tricks on me, and I'd
Mhm.
be like, was it pink? Was it purple? They're both similar. Like, oh no.
And then you're like, is anyone really going to notice? Do I need to go back and skim through that entire book to find that, one hair stripe? And then you're like, I should.
Yeah, at this point, I know exactly
Yeah.
where the characters were. I
Mhm.
remember everything about it except for the color of the hair streak. So I always
Yep.
have to go back to that sticky note in the book. Oh boy. The writer's life, for the readers listening, it's not as it's not crazy difficult, but the
Mhm.
fear that you have when you hit publish and you didn't do your research on your own stuff is
Mhm.
like so terrifying, because the last thing you want is for someone to be like, "Oh my gosh, like do you even know your own work?" Like,
It's funny because that kind of happened to me. Because I know there's this person I know, who volunteers at my library, who, back we were living in before the time of COVID, he was reading my books, and he had finished book two, and he mentioned something, and then like the other shoe drops in my head, and I'm like, oh God, I messed up there. And not only that, that's the macro plot. That is like something vital, and I'm like, I need to figure out how to fix this before I get to book six or seven, and I managed to figure it out. Fortunately I have a lot of time, but I'm like, wow. So good talking to people about your books is good, I guess.
oh yeah.
So I remember I muttered something to him, but in my mind I was panicking, like, oh wow, that's bad.
Oh my gosh. So did that
Yeah.
require like going back and adjusting all your
No.
books?
I managed to sort of figure out how I could make it work because things are so far down the line. So,
Okay.
but it was
Oh,
a very good thing you
oh.
pointed that out.
That's one thing too, and I know there's a lot of talk about like getting reviews, getting feedback, and it's not really a lot of people I feel like consider it to be like, oh, you just want your ego boosted. But really, you never know. Everybody reads the same book,
Mhm.
but the way that your brain processes it and the details that stick out to you are different for everybody usually. So like I read like a how to write like description book once where
Mhm.
they were like, yeah, you can say that the character's shirt was blue, and like everybody will imagine a different shade of blue.
Yeah.
So that's why when you come to like adapting for TV or movies, it's like there's such a debate over like, did it look the way that I imagined it in my head? And like as the writer, we're sort of like laying it down sentence by sentence, and sometimes it's so difficult to see the huge picture. That's why like beta readers are so valuable, because they'll notice things that you've read the same page like 25 times, and you still didn't notice like a glaring thing that to a reader that is just like consuming it for entertainment. It's such a
Yeah.
different experience than after you've written it and your brain has read through it like a zillion times. It's like there's no way that I can read my own stuff for entertainment.
Not to mention, if you're anything like me, like I go through like a journey, I feel like through my edits. Like I start off a book and it's always frustrating and I don't really know what I'm doing. But then as I go through like my multiple rounds of revisions, like I'm like, oh, wait a minute, this is good. This is pretty good. I'm doing well. Like, things are getting more polished. It's starting to look like a real book. And then I get to this point, somewhere around draft 3, where I start obsessing over things like commas and word choice, and like my
Oh,
enjoyability just crashes. And by the time I send it out to like beta readers and editors, I hate my book. Like I have read it way too many times. So I'm like, I am just too deep into this. I need you to read it and let me know if it's good, because I have no idea anymore. So yeah, I always use beta readers, multiple beta readers for my stories, and I highly recommend it for multiple reasons. But
oh
yeah.
yeah. There's people that write fan fiction that use beta readers.
Oh,
So
really? Yeah, I haven't
yeah.
written fan fiction since I was a teenager, but I did not do
Oh my
that.
gosh. I never had beta readers for fan fiction, but I had read people's fan fiction. I think it was for Spider-Man fan fiction too, where they were like, thanks to my beta readers. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that is dedication.
Yes. Oh man.
Yep. So I could talk forever about craft and
Mhm.
what it's so nerdy, but yeah, I will not force you to talk about writing process forever. So you sort of already answered the where's your reader starts with the first book.
Mhm.
Um, so before I wrap up everything and do all that spiel, is there anything that I have not asked you that you would like to talk about, or anything else that you would like to put out in the world that I didn't think of?
No, I think actually, honestly, I wrote down many notes for these questions, and I don't even remember which ones you asked, like in advance, and which ones you asked just here. So I feel like we did a pretty good job.
Excellent.
Yeah.
It's like I never know. Sometimes it's like the nature of the beast is that in the indie superhero world, there's so many like flavors of
Mhm.
superhero fiction that sometimes it's like the questions don't really apply sometimes. So it's like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, your style of story, like please let me know if if I
So, like, how can you ask someone about superpowers if they like write more of like a vigilante justice situation where everyone just shoots each
exactly.
other? So,
Yeah.
yeah,
It's like what are their
yeah,
powers? Their powers is the awesome crossbow.
yep,
Okay.
and a machine gun. Yeah.
Yes. But oh, I love them all. It's like the variety is I feel like what keeps the genre so exciting,
I
because
agree.
we're not locked down by like a corporate structure that's like, no, this is what works. We know that this works. Do it until it's run to the ground. It's like everybody sort of attacks it differently. And it's like such a good source of inspiration. Like I've read stuff that I would have never found anywhere else, just in the little indie sphere. So it's like, oh, so good.
Yeah, I think it's kind of the nature of the beast though when it comes to superheroes, because you've been telling stories for so long. Like I feel like this happened with the Marvel movies, especially as they started going past the origin story phase, and they started like having the different movies that incorporate sort of different types of stories. Like this is the sort of like our space western, and this is our conspiracy thriller and stuff like that. And that's something I've definitely taken to heart with my books. I found like my first, I have like red and black, which is sort of like the hero's first out, and black and blue, which really leans on the superhero romance, and silver and gold, which is not going to go into that. And then we have like the time travel book, the heist book. So it's a really fun way to get to blend genres together and get to explore different types of stories. So I
Oh,
love reading and writing it. So
definitely. I agree wholeheartedly.
yeah.
So good. So I guess that is about all that I have.
Mhm.
So do you want to tell everybody out there listening where can they find your books and where can they find you on the internet if they want to go beyond the page?
Okay. So for my books, you can find them on Amazon. I have, ebooks, print books, and they're also on Kindle Unlimited. So for the Red and Black series, that's Red and Black, Black and Blue, and Silver and Gold. I also have, if you like fantasy as well, I have a short story collection out called The Lady of the Watchtower, 6 stories of magic and transformation, which is 99 cents right now. So if you want something cheap, go read that. I have fairy tale retellings in there. I have wholly original works, so that's as well. And if you're in a spooky mood because it's October, you can head over to my blog where I am doing kind of like a Halloween themed serial where I'm retelling a dark fairy tale, Bluebeard in this case, but I'm making it steampunk. So I'm having a lot of fun with that. So if you want to read something for free, you can go to my website, which is nancyotoole.wordpress.com. And where am I online? All right. So the blog is probably the best place to go, my website, for me. I'm also on social media, at Watch Nancy Tweet on Twitter, and Nancy's Views on Instagram, because I made those accounts a long time ago before I realized that you were supposed to use the same name for everything. So go me.
Well,
Uh,
yeah.
and I have a podcast as well. I'm a huge nerd, as you may have discovered. I love My Hero Academia, and I co-host a podcast called One for All, which is a rewatch podcast. And we had just started season 3, but those episodes haven't posted yet. Okay, we're just finishing up season 2, and we'll be starting season 3 soon. So if you like MHA, you should give that a shot.
Definitely. And for everybody out there, it's like we have so much time to watch, and I'm the type of person that I love to watch something
Mm-hmm.
or read something and then immediately go and be like, what's the discussion? What is
Mm-hmm.
the so like the your podcast sounds like perfect.
When both of us that host it, we're both storytellers in a way. I'm a writer, my co-host is a GM, so we really like to dig down into sort of like the storytelling and the character building elements, and talk way too much about an anime that was made for teenagers, but we have a lot of fun with it. So.
No judgment. I am a big anime fan. So
Mhm.
if you only saw my shelves and all my stuff.
Ah, okay.
But yeah, so well, I guess that is all that I got. So I will just thank you again for being on the show. It's been a blast to chat.
Oh yeah, thank you so much. I've had a lot of fun.
You are welcome. So I'll wrap it up for all the listeners out there. Just reminding you that if you like the podcast, wherever you listened, whether on YouTube or your podcasting sites, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes. Give us a like. Let us know what you think by commenting. Just give us a warning if you talk about spoilers. And as always, just want to thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate you all, whether you are new or old to the podcast, and I will see you next time.